Types of democracy: Athenian democracy, popular democracy, industrial democracy, electoral democracy, dominant party democracy, liquid democracy, revolutionary democracy, parliamentary democracy, presidential democracy, demarchy, organic democracy, cellular democracy, ethnic democracy, theodemocracy, anticipatory democracy, serial democracy, constitutional democracy, economic democracy, grassroots democracy, inclusive democracy, interactive democracy, new democracy, and sociocracy. To enter into this exploration, we will begin with the insights of William Hastie, Tennessee-born professor of law and our country's first Black federal judge. Asserts that democracy is a process, not a static condition. It is becoming rather than being. It can be easily lost, but it is never finally won. Unfortunately, this doesn't bode well for our nervous system. To be in equilibrium, to have a certain level of certainty. Usually this is determined by conditions that have been in place for a while. Our body gets accustomed to it. When our democracy shifts to include more people or to prioritize historically underrepresented voices, we can get to feeling uneasy. I have seen it time and time again, where people feel like they're being left behind, when the community that once catered primarily to them feels fleeting and demonized. This, friends, is a sign that nervous systems might be unregulated. When we aren't able to regulate our nervous systems, we are vulnerable to messages that doubt our worth and dignity, that vie for power over, listening, and humility. Regulating one's nervous system might look like calling a loved one before a board meeting, but instead, doing that instead of focusing on the meeting. It might look like talking about what you're making for dinner or sweet time that you were able to spend with a loved one. Perhaps regulating during that meeting or sermon looks like breathing from your belly. Regulating during that meeting might look like having a cup of water. And after, regulating our nervous systems might look like you spend some time journaling on how you showed up, instead of running to that water cooler meeting after the meeting where you talk about the tea and who said what and things of that sort. Engaging in our governance from a place that remembers our bodies is a place that affirms our worth and dignity. It keeps us open in a space of abundance and healing. Isn't that what you first felt when you walked into a UU church? Isn't it to which we want others to have? This, friends, this governance that acknowledges our body, one way to make democracy come alive. To posit a calling I believe we must have as Unitarian Universalists. As it relates to our histories and principles, our calling is to find where our curiosities meet opportunities for transformation. find where our curiosities meet opportunities for transformation. And to the end that we are a covenantal faith, we ought to be the kind of people that get curious about how we govern with equity. We ought to be the kind of people who invite transformation. We ought to be the kind of people who lead by addressing systemic patterns of harm and withholding of resources based on specious, racial categories or class or gender identity. We ought to be the kind of people who acknowledge that our commitment to the third principle mingles with the fifth principle, that they do not exist in silos. We ought to be the kind of faithful people that labor with love to create governance structures that value many epistemologies, many ways of knowing, not just reason. We ought to be the kind of people who understand liberty as held within the bounds of collective care. Some of us are moving on behalf of a collective memory that only begins at the mouths and keyboards of legitimate leadership. This, friends, is a mistake. For a faith community that uplifts grassroots, who believes in people power, to begin a story with the people in power. To assume that we as a faith are under a top-down authoritarian governance structure is to ignore and erase generations of powerful grassroots organizing from people that ask, if our first principle is true, then why are prisons 38% made up of Black folks when Black people are only 13% of the population? If our first principle is true, then why were hundreds of thousands of young people detained by Border Patrol officers? Why have 14 trans people been killed this year alone? And over half of this number being Black trans women. If this is true, if our first principle is true, almost every faith tradition asks questions of theodicy, or a theological attempt to explain why bad things happen. Our people, collectively through painful stories and heartbreaking research, have come to understand a systems truth in our communities. But here's the thing. Our analysis of white supremacist culture isn't actually new to UUs. The language may be, but a way of understanding our communities on a systemic level is not. It's why we have prolific histories of abolitionists and anti-war organizers. It's why we knew how prophetic it was to have some of the first desegregated preschools. It's why we work today to fight back against voter suppression in Black and brown communities who have been targets of where our curiosity has met opportunities for transformation. Democracy alive. At its core, most forms of democracy are about the people being in control of their lives, when historically others with material wealth and power have been. At its core, democracy acknowledges a system where some people, by virtue of their identities, have accumulated more material wealth and thus power. This because Unitarian Universalism exists within a material reality can also be true of how democracy is lived in our governance structures. The people, the proletariat, or whatever you may want to call them, want to be decision makers in a process that has historically not included them on issues related to their life, their faith communities, their homes. And that's very different than people vying for the same power they've historically had. Honestly, it should be a reality check for each and every one of us as we are calculating and determining how we want to participate in our UU democratic process. Even I need to ask myself, in what ways have I historically had access to power and resources? In what community, in what conversations do I need to listen more? Do I need to be more curious about the experiences of people with less? And in what conversations does my lived experience help to create robust solutions to inequality? In what situations does it help create solutions towards justice, democracy alive? Most types of democracy make a couple of assumptions that we as UUs tend to agree with. In the words of Theodore Parker, it means not I am as good as you are, but you are as good as I am. And this, my friends, is a practice. A thing we have to show up to regularly, daily, hourly, moment by moment. How do we live in the prophetic space between I affirm worth and dignity because I know my worth and dignity, and our structures have historically not been structured on such a premise? Sometimes it means a posture of listening. Sometimes it means advocating with marginalized Black, brown, poor, queer, trans folks to create a more equitable governance structure that sometimes helps our curiosity meet opportunities for transformation. Celebrating when we try something that attempts to create peace, liberty, and justice for all and get it right. Friends, Unitarian Universalism has some life good news. But that good news isn't for people who want platforms to discredit the work of so many people working to dismantle a white supremacy culture that is death-dealing. It's for people who want to build structures that support thriving and self-determination for communities who have been denied it for so long. This good news isn't for people who don't understand that our historic values aren't about a shallow freedom of speech. It's for people invested in our collective liberation who know that dissent can be powerful. For people who don't want to heal from wounds of felt worthlessness. People who are ready to fight for the dignity of everyone. This good news isn't for people who aren't interested in being and exploring right relationship. It's for people who want to be transformed. So friends, as we go through our days, hours, moment by moment, I invite you into this journey of making democracy come alive. Making democracy taste like sweet nectar, that we are bursting at the seams to invite others in, that we take our hammers and nails and build longer tables, wider circles, so that democracy can again and again and again and again come alive. May it be so. Ashe.